4 Stories of the Saints adult formation series, and we have had 3 wonderful storytellers preceding Malinda. Ethel Ware Carter, who is here, right? Who was always gone whenever I say her name. I don't know why that is. Ethel Ware Carter was our first, followed by Carl Walker, and then the wonderful Bob Miller, the wonderful Carl Walker, and the wonderful Ethel Ware Carter. And so thank you for coming, and we are excited. I'm getting my picture taken out of a dirty coffee cup in my hand. So we are excited for Malinda's story. It has been wonderful to work with Malinda and to watch, as it has been with all the storytellers, and to watch their stories evolve into these really amazing and dynamic creations. So without further ado, please welcome Malinda Snow.
Thank you. I want to introduce just a little bit of what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you a story that takes place mostly in 1922, and it takes place mostly in South Georgia in a town called Cuthbert, which is here where you're about 25 miles from Alabama. It's close to the Chattahoochee River, and it involves my grandfather and my grandmother and my mother, and I'll do my best to tell you some things that I learned about them. Drifts of dogwood were beginning to appear in the woods along the side of the road that led from our house to town. Nobody but my mother would have begun this story with that sentence. One of the things that my mother and I had in common was that both of our fathers had died young. And I grew up in a household that was headed by my mother and my grandmother. In our household, my father was still fairly evident in the rooms. My mother had a picture of him on her dresser, and a picture of both of them in their wedding clothes hung on the wall. But there was no picture of my grandfather. There was no picture of my grandfather that was on display anywhere in the house. And it wasn't as if we didn't have pictures of him. I had seen pictures of him and could go to the box where the family pictures were kept and find some of those pictures anytime I wanted to. There was one picture, for example, that showed the family in which he grew up, and that was one of those big Victorian families where the oldest of the children are a whole generation older than the youngest children. My grandfather's oldest siblings, grown men with mustaches and watch chains. The oldest sister, corseted and dressed in women's clothes with her hair done up in a do on top of her head. Clearly grown up, clearly adults. My grandfather is this baby sitting alertly on his mother's lap, looking at the photographer. Who are you and what are you doing? And I liked that picture. That was an interesting one that I enjoyed seeing. And this is my grandfather as a grown man. His name was David Baldwin, and this picture was probably made about 1910. This is his wife, my grandmother. Her name was Irene Charley, and they had grown up in Cuthbert, the little town that I was pointing to a moment ago. They had grown up down there, known each other all their lives, went to school together, to Miss Ida Dominguez's school, and they married in 1913. They had 3 children. My mother was the eldest of the children. She had a younger sister, and they had a brother who was born when my mother was 7 years old. My grandfather was an ambitious young man. He was the youngest child of a man who had served in the Civil War. He was the youngest child of a man who was a country physician and his wife who came from a family of local politicians. And my grandfather wished to create a big, forward-thinking, expansive farming operation. And by 1920, he had acquired sizable acreage and was producing lots and lots of goods to sell. My mother remembered that there was a railroad siding that came into their property so that cars could come in and go out, bringing things that they had purchased, equipment, livestock, things like that, and carrying out, shipping out the produce of the farm. I was naturally curious about my grandfather, somebody that I didn't know. I was naturally curious about him, and I was alert for details that would come up in conversation about him. I learned just at listening to my mother and grandmother talk and be reminded of something that brought him to mind. They would say this or that. I learned, for example, that my grandparents had worn the same size shoe. And that when he wanted to make the children laugh, my grandfather would put on my grandmother's shoes and mince around the house, and he did make the children laugh. I learned also that he was fond of what we call Durkee's mayonnaise. Good, you know. That interested me because I liked it too. And my grandmother laughed and said, I think he would have eaten shucks if they'd had Durkee's on. Well, interesting little comments like that add to your notion of a person, but they're not a story. And what I wanted was a story, a coherent story that would help me know this man better. My own father I knew more about because I had the opportunity to talk to his own parents and learn stories about him from them. And my mother had told me a good deal about him as well, but I didn't remember him specifically because he died too soon. The thing I was most curious about, child-wise perhaps, was what had happened to my grandfather. And children, I think, have a kind of a natural sense of how to deal with their audience, the adults that they're talking to. And I realized that this was not a question that I was going to get a lot of detail about because my mother and grandmother just didn't talk about it. But I decided that some moment was propitious. I must have been about 6 years old. And I asked my mother, what happened to him? And she looked me straight in the eye and said, he was shot. And I could tell by the way she said shot that I wasn't going to get any more details that day. So I kept my ears open and my eyes open and continued to gather information really throughout the time that I was growing up. I didn't grow up down here in Cuthbert where my grandparents and parents lived. I grew up in Forsyth, Georgia, which is right here, and south of here, between here and Macon. That's where my grandmother and mother and I lived. My mother was teaching there. In the course of our conversations, I learned that my grandfather was shot on the square in Cuthbert in 1922, that he was shot by a man who was arguing with him, and they were arguing about one man's accusation of the other that he had poached an employee, that he had sought to hire away an employee from the other man. And what I believe is that my grandfather had found someone who had perhaps skills that he valued, and that he made that man a better offer and persuaded him to shift employers. And the other man was angry about that. That's my surmise, at least. Throughout the time I was growing up and not getting a coherent story then, I was collecting information that became a kind of a foundation for my understanding of the story that I knew existed somewhere. When I went away to college, my mother and I started a correspondence that lasted almost 40 years. We wrote to each other every week. I always got my letter from her on Tuesday. And one day, doesn't seem so terribly long ago now, one day I came home from school and I found in my mailbox a business-size envelope addressed in her small, difficult, up-slatting handwriting, hard to read. And when I opened the envelope, I found a thick packet of papers that was entitled My Father's Death. It was signed by my mother, whose name was Carolyn Baldwin. It was signed by my mother and dated the current date, 1984. And so my mother was nearly 70. She was going to turn 70 in 1984. She had held on to this story all those years, and she tells it as freshly and as fully detailed as if it had just happened to her. So she begins the story with the sentence about the dogwood. And she goes on to continue from there to explain what was happening. She said, Daddy was taking Aunt Bessie and her children. Aunt Bessie was one of my grandfather's sisters. She's actually in this picture. She's a little girl sitting here, sort of in front of the big sister. Aunt Bessie was also my mother's first grade teacher. And Mama wrote, Aunt Bessie and her children had spent the day with us that Sunday, and Daddy was driving them home, and she was with them in the car. That week must have started off fairly normally. Monday seems to have been a routine day. She doesn't mention it. But on Tuesday morning, she was in the classroom, and a knock came on the door. Aunt Bessie, the teacher, answered the door, and soon the children heard a gasp and then a little scream. And in a few moments, someone came into the classroom and got my mother, a little 7-year-old child, out of this first grade classroom, took her out into the hall where there were lots of adults, and she was told that her father had been killed. She says, I don't remember crying, I just remember feeling stunned and lost. She recalled seeing several people whom she recognized among the people standing in the school hallway, and one of the ladies was the wife of their doctor. Those two women took her to a car and took her home, and when they got to her house, which was about 6 miles out from town, when they got to the house, the yard and the house were full of people. She said the yard was full of people, the house was full of people, and they were talking and crying. She walked through this crowd of people to find her mother, and they both embraced and they both wept. I'm not sure when this next scene happens. It may have been that night or it may have been the next day. But my mother remembered going back to town to Aunt Bessie's house where my grandfather's body was laid out in the casket. This was in the day before funeral homes. And my mother said that there were extra chairs all over the house, in the parlor, in the dining room, in the hall, where people had come to offer their condolences and talk and visit, as people do. She doesn't remember people talking to her very much about what had happened or about her own sense of grief. She remembers them wanting to touch her. She remembers that people would reach out and pat her. She remembered on this occasion that what she spoke of as the soft, fat bosom and the perfume of a lady who was a family friend who reached out to embrace her. She was taken in to see her father's body, and she said, nothing could have prepared me for that. Country children, she said, know about death, but I looked down on a stone-like face that both was and was not the face of my handsome young father. She goes on describing that same evening. She goes on to say, I was not in the room when Mother was led in to see him, but I can still hear her anguished cry. Oh, David, David, your hands are so cold. And my heart broke for him, for her, for all of us, she said. She described the funeral and zeroed in on the preacher, whom she said was a small man, very proper, more proper than anybody else. If he said any words of comfort, she said, I don't remember them. He never spoke any words of comfort to me. He never reached out to me. What she did notice, in addition to the preacher at the funeral, was her mother's clothing. She remembered the black suit and the black veil. And she remembered the flowers. That's my mother. She remembered flowers. Whatever else is happening to her, if there are flowers there, she remembers them. And in many ways, it was a saving grace for her, because she had a capacity to see what was beautiful and to want to make what was beautiful and to have what was beautiful. She noticed the flowers, she noticed the construction of the wreaths and the sprays, and she said with awe, even as she looked back on it, there were flowers there that I didn't know the names of. She was 7 years old, and she knew enough names of flowers to be surprised that she didn't know the names of these. After the funeral, I'm not sure whether it was that evening or another evening, she remembers a gathering at her parents' house. She remembers men who were family friends, a couple of her uncles, a couple of these men who were her father's brothers, and some women as well, sitting in the parlor talking. They had come specifically to offer not just condolences, but advice to my grandmother. And they were there. She remembers the men with their long legs man spread in the parlor. She remembers one of her uncles talking too much and too loud. And that was the way he was. I remember him too. she remembers that they were interfering. Irene, they said, this is what you should do. This is what you should do about the house, about the property, about the money. They were trying to be helpful. I mean, most people are trying to be helpful when they interfere. And there's no denying that. And yet it was disturbing to her, and the talk about money, I think, was disturbing to her. She says, I came away from it feeling that we must be very poor. That is probably a good stopping place for the story. My mother goes on to talk more about what happened in following months and even years, but the event that I wanted to hear about was the event that I have told you, the story of my grandfather's death. I found out what happened to him. I didn't find out everything about why and how, but I found out what. And I found out the details that must have been too painful for my mother to speak. They must have been too painful for my grandmother to think of telling me. And I understand, I don't hold it against them at all that they didn't tell me the story. I understand that they couldn't. And that they were doing what seemed best to them at the time. They created a very happy home for me to grow up in. We enjoyed our time together as a family. We loved the occupations and the pastimes that we engaged in. We loved to read, to listen to the radio, to cook, to garden, to watch the birds, to talk. We enjoyed sitting on the front porch in the summertime and talking, listening to the night sounds, watching things come and go. We enjoyed sitting by the heater. We remember gas heaters? We enjoyed sitting by the heater in the wintertime and listening to the radio, and maybe reading, and talking or singing or doing something that was fun. I learned so much from them. And I'm so grateful to them for making a happy home that I will always value. And I understand that they could not tell me this story. They could not on the front porch could they tell me this story. Not by the hissing gas heater could they tell me this story. Not even in that most intimate of family spaces, the car, could they tell me this story. But I feel now that I got the long envelope and am possessed of the story, I feel that I'm a steward of it. And I feel that having got the story, I have things to do with it. And so when I was approached about telling you all a story, I decided to tell you this one. And I don't know what I'm going to do with it next, but you're a stage in the process of my attempting to be a good steward of this story. And I would be happy to talk with you now and to answer any questions that you might have about it.
You know, when you were telling that story, I just thought, this sounds like something that Eudora Welty would have written. It honestly, those of us who are from Georgia, even if we grew up in the big city rather than the country, we grew up with relatives who were from the country. My grandmother was from Jackson, Georgia, outside Jackson.
Right north of Forsyth.
Just north of Forsyth,
Right.
yeah. And that kind of story would have come out of any of that kind of milieu. And maybe a little bit, maybe a generation before that could have come out of Atlanta's milieu.
Could have.
But probably not in 1922 is what it readily. But still, it just sounds like the quintessential Southern story. Eudora Welty, William Faulkner, something. And you told it so well. So I just, you get us caught up into the very rhythm of it.
Yeah.
There is a rhythm of life involved in that kind of thing.
much more mundane question. What happened to the guy who shot your grandfather?
Well, it's a good question for a lawyer to ask. Of course, there was a trial, and my mother was taken to the trial for at least 2 days. And some lawyer probably thought it was a good idea to take the bereaved children to the courtroom. She was there for the jury selection. She heard the questions that lawyers asked of the jury panel. And one impression that she got from that was nobody wanted to be on that jury. Nobody. Because everybody knew both families. And there was just nothing you could do that wouldn't offend somebody. She remembered one man saying, I can't possibly be on this jury. I'm kin to them. And she thought to herself, I don't think he's kin to us. I never remember anybody telling me he was kin to us. And I looked at him, she said, and I thought he looked like somebody who was making excuses for himself. Another day she went to the courtroom and heard whatever was going on and saw a lawyer hold up my grandfather's clothes, the clothes that he'd been wearing when he was shot, even his underwear blood-stained. The jury that was finally shoehorned in deadlocked. There was a hung jury. And so there was no guilty or not guilty verdict, and the shooter walked free. And you may say, well, what a shame, why would this have happened this way? I don't think there were any witnesses to the shooting who made themselves known. My mother told me that when the women took her out of the schoolroom and put her in the car, they drove around the square several times looking for somebody. It had been said that somebody saw the shooting, but that person just made himself scarce quickly, and they never found him. So there were no witnesses to call. And the only thing in support of my grandfather's lawyer's case was whatever he could cook up to make the people sympathetic. I have wondered, I didn't mention the shooter's name, and I'm not going to, because that family still lives down there, and so does mine. And I've wondered how this affected him. I've wondered whether he was glad he did it, sorry he did it. I tell you what I think, and this is part of my speculation again. In the Jim Crow South in the 1920s, there were still white landowners who forgot that emancipation had taken place. And they felt a kind of ownership of the people who worked on their farms. The employee who was stolen away, quote, was a black man. Oops. And I think that the shooter regarded this man, his employee, almost as if his property had been taken from him. And his honor was somehow challenged, yes. And I think that's what set off his anger in the first place. That seems, to me, logical. And so all I can say about what happened to him is that he was older than my grandfather, but he lived out his life, probably still a rather violent and angry man.
I wouldn't say that the basic pieces of my story are a whole lot different from yours, or you know, especially with reference to the question of being Southern, and the same thing got told to me. My paternal grandmother may have told my mother the story, but nothing ever really got filtered down to me until my nephew appears out of the woodwork. He had been adopted out, one can imagine the circumstances, and says to me, hi, and I go, oh, you're something new. And then research, and well, it's a very, to me, interesting story, but I've had to stand back and do some emotional adjustment at some of the things I've heard.
Well, what you say, Tom, brings up a point that I think is really useful and interesting. And it's part of the basis for me telling this story. I'm assuming that I'm not the only one in our All Saints circle who has gun violence in the back of their lives. I'm assuming that you probably thought you were, if you do have gun violence in your life, and that you kind of didn't talk about it for those reasons. We obviously need to talk about gun violence as a society. We need to make ourselves do that. And it seems to me that we can begin to make progress and make attitudes change if we accept the fact that most of us have gun violence somewhere in our family background. You're talking about Southern experience. It's not just Southern experience. It's kind of frontier experience, and the frontier has been moving. It continues to move, and from east to west in Georgia, it moves just as it does anywhere else. We have to understand that it's such a common attitude about guns and the use of guns in not just in mass shootings, but in moments of individual anger or frustration or distress that we have to address. And so I wanted to speak of it not just on my own personal account, but on that account as well. Mm-hmm.
What did your mother do with the farm? Your grandmother?
My grandmother, she sold it. She sold the farm, and whatever money she got from that, she entrusted to one of my grandfather's friends, who was a banker. He came to her and asked her, would you like for me to advise you about investments and what to do with your money and help you with the settlement of the financial side of the estate? And she said yes. I mean, she trusted him and thought it was probably the right thing to do. Well, he lost the money. And he either lost it or stole it. And that's another story. That's an interesting story. But
that always comes out.
She had access to it for a while. He lost it. She wasn't just a pushover. She sued the pants off of him. And she won the pants off of him. But it wasn't until 1940 that it was all settled. And so she worked at various things. She was a teacher. She worked for, I think, Farm Security Administration during the Depression. She was a college dietitian. And in the late 1940s, when my mother and I needed her, she came to live with us. That's what she did.
Do you have any idea of what inspired her to tell you the whole story finally in 1984?
My mother had a kind of honesty about her that I can't emphasize enough. She was, I remember one time, I don't remember why she said this or what I had said that prompted, but she said, I will never lie to you. And I believe her literally on that account. She was a very honest person, and I think she knew as much as I did that this story needed to be told, and that she was in a position to tell it probably better than anybody else. Because my mother's sister, who was 4 years younger than she, wouldn't have remembered much, and their brother, who was an infant when his father died, didn't remember anything. And so she knew she was the custodian of the story. And she had, after she retired, she had become involved in a good deal of genealogical research, where she was going to various document repositories, she was going to public libraries and to the archives, to courthouses and newspaper offices, and doing a lot of reading, not just about that one event, but about history generally, local history and family history. And so it would have been on her mind. I think it was on her mind all along to make sure I knew this. And it was one of the things that she did as far as putting things in order, so to speak. She liked to put things in order. She was the sort of person who kept receipts and things like that. And she liked to make sure that documents and other materials that you might want were where you could find them. And I don't know that she knew what I was going to do with this story, but she knew that it was part of what she needed to give me. And she was a very careful writer. She was a good writer. And she had clearly taken pains with the story. I haven't told you anything like all of it. She felt that this was her responsibility to herself, to me, and to her parents.
Is there something publishable in all of this?
Maybe so, I don't know. We'll cross that, we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. What I wanted to get out of the story specifically was what my grandfather meant to them and what he could mean to me. And I want to come back to one thing before I stop talking: the dogwoods. My mother goes on to tell what happened as they passed the dogwoods, as they were going down the Georgia Midland Road, little dirt road, going toward town. She said, Daddy stopped the car and got out and cut some dogwood boughs for us to take back with us to town to enjoy during the week. It's a moment of grace, I think, that she remembered that. It's a moment of grace that she put it in the story. It's a moment of grace that I learned that my grandfather was a man who would stop the car for beautiful flowers because his daughter was one who did that. I've crawled through many a fence and cut down many a beautiful botanical specimen while riding with my mother. And
then run.
well, we never got caught. I like to know that my grandfather was a man who loved flowers and who knew that his sister and his little girl might enjoy the flowers, and who stopped, got out in his good clothes. I know he was wearing his good clothes. It was Sunday afternoon, and he was a sharp dresser. Fought his way through the briars and the weeds off the Georgia Midland Road, cut the boughs, and brought them back. I love the fact that my mother remembered that detail and put it in the story. It's somehow almost worth hearing the story to learn that detail about this man who was so beloved by the people that I loved most in the whole